lecture for Psych 350. We'll be talking about research relevant to behaviorist and social learning approaches to understanding personality. One of the areas of research that the behaviorists and kind of learning theorists have applied their work to is looking at gender roles. Right? And gender roles are socially constructed, agreed upon norms or rules for how to act, right, that are associated with your biological gender. Boys and men are to act one way, and girls and women are to act another. Right? So there's a manly way of being and a womanly way of being, or a masculine way and a feminine way. And one thing that research has identified and provided support for is that these gender roles don't appear to be, at least not entirely biologically defined, but seem to be created and supported by learning experiences or conditioning experiences, largely via operant conditioning. From an early age, we treat children differently based on their biological sex. Right? We reward and punish or withhold rewards for certain behaviors. Right? For gender consistent behaviors, we give rewards. For gender inconsistent behaviors, we either punish or withhold rewards. And well, no, nobody spanks a kid when you're gender inconsistent, but you do reinforce their behaviors in a certain way. Think about a boy who plays with dolls, and what some fathers might say. Some might punish at the level of kind of think about punishing with spanking, but many will make some sort of negative comment or take the doll away or introduce some other toy and then begin reinforcing that. No, you don't want that. Here's this gun. Play with this. Right? Same thing for girls. If a girl, I remember my wife always tells the story about how she wanted a Red Ryder BB gun for Christmas. I was so excited. She thought she was going to get one. Long, slender package. Opened it up. It was a mop and broom. A small toy, mop and broom. Sending a very clear message of this is your gender role. And research has supported that not only do we do that, we treat children differently and adults differently, but even at an early age, kids perceive this differential treatment. They are aware of the unwritten rules. Nobody has to tell them this is a boy thing, this is a girl thing. We do. They develop a sense of what boys are supposed to do and what girls are supposed to do, and they seem to fear punishment for engaging in gender atypical behavior. So what do we mean when we talk about masculinity and femininity? Really, better terms are probably agency and communion. Right? Because the terms masculine and femininity are associated with biological genders, right? And the implication is that these behavioral tendencies are biological. That, okay, well, men are masculine and women are feminine. And also implies at a kind of implicit level that being different, if you're a man that isn't very masculine or feminine, or vice versa, if you're a woman who's masculine, then that's somehow weird or not right. And so, because science is supposed to be value-free, many people prefer the terms agency and communion. With agency referred to what's typically been thought to be stereotypically masculine gender role, and communion, the stereotypically feminine gender role. Terms haven't caught on with everybody yet, but they do make good sense. In agency, masculinity being associated with assertiveness, independence, aggression even. In communion, associated with dependence, but also cooperation, and more of a relational approach to interacting, versus agency being more competitive. So one of the first questions that researchers addressed was, well, when we look at gender roles, is it unidimensional or is it some sort of two-dimensional construct? And at first they thought it was unidimensional, right, where you had masculinity on one end and femininity on the other. And so if you are more masculine, you're there by biological deduction, you're less feminine. And if you're very feminine, you can't be very masculine, right? If you move toward one, you're moving away from the other. And that's kind of how people thought about it, but it doesn't seem to be consistent with how people are. And that people can be high in both masculinity and femininity. They can be low in both masculinity and femininity, or they can be any combination of the two. They do seem to be two dimensions, two relatively independent dimensions. I wouldn't say completely independent, but relatively independent. Because, again, for many people, depending on how you measure it, certain measures of agency are correlated with measures of communion, but it's definitely not a perfect correlation. If for one dimension, you'd have a perfect correlation of -1, or when you're high in agency, you're always low in communion. It's not that, but there is a correlation. They're somewhat related, but still two somewhat related, somewhat independent dimensions where you can be high or low on either one. And if you're high on both, then rather than being masculine and feminine, they use the term androgynous. You're high in androgyny. So, in terms of your think about personality, if you're typically higher in masculinity or higher in femininity, or maybe high in both, high in androgyny, or low in both, what might be referred to as undifferentiated, so not clearly masculine or feminine, or both. What does that say about you? Because it seems to be a stable thing, right? You aren't masculine one day and feminine the next, or you're not high in masculinity one day and low in masculinity the next. It seems to be a stable aspect of personality. What about it? Well, it seems to be related to well-being. And the question that researchers asked was it better to be congruent, and that is, for men to be masculine and women to be feminine? That's kind of the congruency hypothesis. Or is it better to be masculine? Or is it better to be high in femininity? Or is it better to be androgynous? Well, there's not much support for the congruency hypothesis. Really masculine men and really feminine women don't score higher in measures of well-being. And people who are incongruous or discrepant don't necessarily score lower in measures of well-being. For other hypotheses, the evidence is a little more complex. It's a little bit mixed. And it's influenced by how you measure gender and also how you measure self-esteem. How you measure well-being. Because one of the things that they often talk about as well, people who are higher in masculinity are higher in well-being because they have higher self-esteem, so they feel better about themselves. But depending on how self-esteem is measured, that may or may not be a valid measurement of well-being. Just because you feel good about yourself doesn't mean that you're functioning well. So you can kind of think of we think about extremes, the ultimate kind of narcissist who only puts their own feelings first and doesn't worry about anybody else. Yeah, I feel great, I'm doing good, I got all this money, I got this nice big house, I'm awesome. But from other perspectives, I think, well, that person doesn't really seem to be doing that well. They have limited relational contacts, and they have maybe some external things, but they don't seem to have much meaning in their life other than these material things. So debatable about if self-esteem is the same thing as well-being. But certainly, measures of masculinity tend to be associated with higher self-esteem. Part of that too is because of how we measure gender. If you use a BIM sexual inventory, you give these masculine adjectives and feminine adjectives, and the other research has shown that the masculine adjectives are rated as more positive. They're seen as good things, and a lot of the feminine adjectives are seen as less desirable. So people that feel good about themselves will pick the masculine things, even if they're not necessarily more masculine. If we use different words for femininity, for the feminine gender role, that were more positive, then some of those differences might go away. Same thing if you use less positive things for masculinity. Right? Instead of saying, I'm high in independence, you said, okay, do you refuse to rely on anyone for help? Okay, people who feel good about themselves may not select that, because now that doesn't seem quite so positive. But some support for, again, higher scores on measures of masculinity associated with higher self-esteem. and probably that the idea of androgyny being associated with well-being is probably closer to the truth, but not all androgyny, because androgyny is high masculinity, high femininity. Depends on which aspects of masculinity, which aspects of femininity you're endorsing, right? Because people who are high in androgyny aren't necessarily a homogenous group. There can be different ways to be androgynous. And there are probably some traits associated with masculinity, like assertiveness, that are associated with well-being. But then there are some other traits that are associated with femininity or communion, for example, emotional expression, that are also associated with well-being. So if you have kind of the good traits from those two groups together, then you're more likely to be doing well. So again, it's some combination of masculine and feminine traits that's the ideal in terms of supporting psychological well-being. So a little bit of both. But one thing that's pretty clear is too much of one or the other, not such a good thing, right? Unmitigated communion, unmitigated agency. This is where you're super high on masculinity or super high on femininity and not high on the other. So high on one and low on the other. So being extreme in either dimension seems to be not so good for you. Interesting that the text only looks at unmitigated communion. It talks about it being associated with negative outcomes, but there is research out there as well on unmitigated agency as well, and it's just that both of these things are associated with both negative relationship outcomes and poor health outcomes, but for different reasons. For unmitigated communion, it's because of higher scores on measures of dependency and the subjugation of one's own needs, and putting yourself last to kind of a pathological degree. But then for unmitigated agency, with kind of high masculinity, poor outcomes are associated with that because of an unwillingness to attend to relationships and also negative views of others. So again, not being able to ask for help or take other people's advice seriously because you know everything, you can do it all yourself because you are fully independent. So like most things in life, extremes, not so good. Okay, what about gender roles and how people are in relationships? You're thinking, okay, well, it's good to be, you want to have this complementarity, right? A very masculine person with a very feminine person. And some people argue, okay, well, man and woman, this is because opposites attract, and this is the way it should be. So we say, okay, even in some same-sex relationships, there's the man role and the woman role, which isn't true. But for some reason, that makes sense to us, this idea of complementarity of yin and yang. But doesn't seem to be true in terms of healthy relationships and people being happy with their relationships. If you have an ultra-masculine man and an ultra-feminine woman, they're not going to be happy together. Happiness seems to come from when both partners are androgynous or high in femininity. And usually it's with either both androgynous or an androgynous male and a feminine female. But again, if you had a feminine male and a masculine female, they wouldn't be happy either. They both need to have some level of femininity, which, depending on their levels of masculinity, they both may or may not be androgynous. And the androgynous, one of them being androgynous, seems to be important because you have to have some of these masculine and feminine traits. You have to be able to have a healthy relationship. You have to be able to listen to people, which is associated with femininity and communion and being receptive to the expressions of others. But you also need some of that masculine trait of assertiveness in terms of expressing your own emotions. Because if one person is listening, the other person is talking, and there's no exchange, there's no reciprocation, then that's also not going to lead to healthy relationships, as we've talked about before. So again, both people need to have some level of femininity to have a satisfied, happy relationship. Okay, what about aggression? This is something that there's a ton of research on, really interesting stuff. Looking at modeled aggression, right? So the imitation of violence. Whenever people see violence on TV and movies and other forms of media, sometimes they copy it, right? And sometimes we have these horrific acts of violence. People say, "Oh yeah, I saw this on this movie, and I watched it 1,000 times, and I wanted to do it just like them." But not everybody does that. We all watch a lot of violent stuff, and you can't help but watch violent stuff because it's everywhere. It's permeated every aspect of our culture. You want the new Cars movie, sweet little cartoon movie for kids, nice. They come out with a sequel. Now the sweet little cars that race around, they have guns, right? Because we are a violent culture. But why do some of us imitate the violence and others don't? Well, according to Bandura, there's this kind of four-step model that accounts for why some people will, some people won't. But it's not simply seeing violence won't necessarily lead to the imitation. Four things have to happen. First, you have to attend to the modeled violence, right? And the degree to which we pay attention to a violent model depends on a lot of things. Two of which are the degree of violence, right? So something that's more violent will get our attention more than mild violence. And what is mild violence? Well, what we consider mild violence is probably much more violent than what our grandparents would have considered mild violence, because we've become increasingly desensitized. So we can see fairly violent stuff now, and it's this stuff's blowing up, the guy got shot in the head. Okay, but you don't even think twice about it. Versus 30 years ago, that might have been scarred and really paid attention to it. But the degree of violence, and also our own frame of mind when we're seeing the violence. If you're more aroused, usually an angry arousal frame of mind when watching a violent model, you're more likely to imitate it later. You're more likely to pay attention to it because it matches your state of mind. But you have to pay attention, and then you have to remember it later. Right? And the likelihood of remembering depends on a lot of things. One of which, though, is how the information is encoded. Right? We're talking about encoding information, storing information, and retrieving information. Right? So whenever information is being encoded, how we're putting it into our brains to pull back out later. One of the things we know from memory research is that personally relevant information is encoded at a deeper level than irrelevant information. Or, so if there's a string of letters, then you have to try to memorize those. Might be hard to do, but if the string of letters happen to form a word, or even maybe you can kind of see, okay, these letters here, they are the abbreviations of 3 of the states that I've lived in. Now you will remember that information you'd be much more likely to remember it if you can kind of relate it to something personal. Right? Oh, I lived in Oklahoma, Texas, and Arizona. Okay, I can get those letters. Versus the same number of letters that don't have personal meaning to you. So, same thing with violence. If you relate the violent act to something yourself, which goes to how similar you see yourself to the model, and how relevant that situation is that you're seeing, more likely to remember it. So more realistic violence versus your sci-fi fantasy violence. More realistic violence is typically more personally relevant, and so more likely to be remembered. Then you're still not necessarily going to imitate it. You have to be able to enact the violence, to imitate it, which means both having the ability and the opportunity. So again, I'm not going to go to the grocery store and mow somebody down with a lightsaber, because you don't have one. If you don't have a gun, you're not going to go shoot people. If you're not a kung fu master, you're not going to do the crane kick. So you have to have the ability and the opportunity to enact it. And then last, and this is an important one, your expectations for the violence have to be those of reward and not punishment. What you expect to happen often depends, again, on what's modeled. So did the model get rewarded, right? Vicarious reinforcement, or did the model get punished? If the model got punished, you're less likely to expect reward. So it's like whenever we see little kids imitating violence they've seen on TV, they usually fight like the good guy. Right? They don't fight like the bad guy on the cartoon or the TV show. You always fight like the good guy, because they're the one that gets reward and is looked up to for their use of violence. So according to me, you have to have all these things to imitate violence, which isn't the same thing as saying that watching violent media will only affect your behavior if all these things happen. That's a different thing, but you'll only imitate, you only do the same act if these things happen. In terms of how does watching violence affect your behavior in other ways, that's a question for imitation, these 4 steps. And generally, what do we know about the impact of violence on TV? There's a definite relationship, and for a while we thought, okay, we can show this kind of correlational relationship, but is it really really causative? Yeah, it is causative. Watching violence on TV makes people more violent, right? And so it was just when you watch something that's arousing, you get your blood pumping, and then you may go out and be more violent. No, they've done a lot of experiments with this and show people arousing videos, one with violent content, one with not. You have the same level of physiological arousal in both groups. Both have the heart rate going. One group is violent, one's not. The one that saw violence is more violent than the one that isn't. And the experimental data tends to be supportive of kind of these short-term effects of aggression. So there's an immediate increase in aggression right after we show it to you, but it doesn't last. But so the question is, well, watching a lot of violence, does it have a long-term impact? Yeah, we think so. Now, it's harder to do experimental studies of this. It's harder to show a clear causal link because we can't show people a lot of violence in a controlled condition and show other people a lot of violence in a controlled condition and follow them for a long time. It's unethical. But looking at the correlation data, where we just look at people who watch a lot of violence or just watch a lot of TV, which de facto has a lot of violence, that tends to be associated, correlated with more violence, greater likelihood of committing a violent crime, of getting in fights, all these things associated with physical aggression. And although there is a relationship between preference for watching violence and aggression, so we say, oh, well, the correlation is only there because people who liked to watch violent stuff watch it, and they also like to be violent. So the watching isn't causing it. There's some other variable that's causing people to be aggressive, and they also like watching violent TV. Even though that's true, the level of correlation between amount of watching violence and amount of expression of violence cannot be explained by this other relationship using kind of statistical modeling. So yeah, that counts for some of it, but not all of it. So yes, watching violence on TV definitely makes people more violent. And one other kind of interesting thing before we move on is the aggression that's demonstrated even in the short term isn't always the exact same as what's modeled. So there seems to be some response generalization. So, and this kind of gets away from Bandura's ideas a bit that, okay, well, even if you can't enact the exact violence, if you watch some violence, see somebody using aggression, you may think, okay, well, I don't have a lightsaber, but I can use this stick. Well, it's just as good. So people might do the exact same. They may get further away from the model violence. So now with the steadily increasing popularity of video games, especially violent video games, researchers said, oh geez, this could be problems, because we've already figured out that watching violence is bad. Now we have people watching violence and being active participants in creating the violence and being rewarded for enacting violent acts, right? Whenever you shoot more bad guys, you get more points, right? They aren't, the most popular video game out there isn't Heart Surgeon. You gotta save lives. No, it's shoot the bad guys. Sometimes it's even shoot the good guys, right? You're a bad guy, shoot as many cops as you can. Might that lead to more aggressive behavior? Yeah. Oh yeah. Researchers said definitely, and it's a stronger effect than watching violence on TV, and probably because you're practicing enacting violence. So, does that mean if you watch violent video games, you're going to go shoot everybody at your school? No, but the more you watch violent video games, the more likely it is you will engage in violence. So there definitely is room for concern, especially if you're a parent. There's kids that plays a lot of violent video games. It would be wise to attend to that. Okay, another concept that the behaviorists have spent a lot of time looking at is this one of learned helplessness, which we first started talking about because they did some things that are fairly unsavory to some people, to many people, which was the ethical treatment of animals. Shocking dogs, right? These early experiences where they would deliver uncontrollable shocks to dogs. So remember, we had this is in the context of doing these experiments where they would see if animals could learn things by rewarding them. They said, okay, what about punishing? Okay, so if we shock them, can they learn to turn off something? And they said, okay, that's cool, that's neat. And then somebody had the idea, well, what if they can't turn off the shock? And so they would shock these dogs. They'd have this grid, and the dog would be on it, and they would turn it on. This painful stimulus would come up, and there may be a button there, or someplace they could move to that you would think, okay, well, that would turn off. But now it doesn't turn it off. Right? No matter what the dog does, the shock doesn't stop. Right? That's uncontrolled shock. And they weren't interested in saying, well, let's see what happens when we do that, although they were interested in it. The premise was, okay, after we do that, after we show that, okay, there's nothing you can do, what if we now give you a chance to do something? So now we're going to have this little panel in the room where if you just move right over here, you will turn the shock off and you'll be fine. And what they found is that dogs that had been victims of the uncontrollable shock didn't move to turn it off, versus dogs that hadn't been victims of uncontrollable shock said, oh yeah, moved around, figured, oh, whoop, that feels better, thanks, and escaped the shock. So they concluded that the uncontrollable shock led to a sense of learned helplessness. So that they couldn't learn to escape because they didn't try, because they developed some sense that they couldn't do anything about it, and that they weren't able to learn until they were physically placed on the area that turns off the shock. So this is kind of important. So they could learn, but they had to physically pick them up and put them on the area. And after that, turn on the shock and they would go to that area. So something I just want you to kind of think about is, what are the implications of that? Well, if you physically move them, then they could do it. What are the implications of that for therapy? As we talk about this other stuff about learned helplessness and depression. So a lot of studies with dogs, and then they extended it to people. Obviously, people will sue you if you shock them. So they had to do other things like loud noises, noxious fumes, other aversive stimuli that they could either stop or not stop based on things that they were doing, which was manipulated by the experimenters. Some people were able to turn it off, some people weren't. And they found the same thing happened, that then when given a chance to do these tasks again later, people who had a sense of helplessness didn't try as hard and took longer to figure things out. And not only that, but there is this, they were able to identify that vicarious learning happens too, such that watching other people be helpless can lead to a sense of learned helplessness. Where you see somebody else, they have these loud noises blaring. You see somebody hitting the buttons on a panel trying to figure out how to turn it off, and they can't. And then you see them finally give up and just endure the loud noises until it stops. And then they say, okay, your turn. Whenever you go in, you're less likely to hit as many button combinations as somebody who didn't see that person be helpless. So a sense of the helplessness can be induced by watching somebody else have unavoidable aversive consequences. So why does it happen? It seems like that's not good. I thought we were adaptive creatures, but if you think about it, this may be adaptive. Maybe an adaptive mechanism, both in terms of when you figure out you're helpless, to not try to do things, and also when you see other people, to not try to do things. The idea being, kind of save your strength and endure, because nothing can be done for now. Right? The idea that people who were really unable to escape aversive stimuli, those that stopped trying and conserved their energy, were better able to address some other problem in the future, versus somebody else who continued trying to do something about a negative experience that couldn't be controlled. So again, learned helplessness, although we tend to think of it as kind of as a negative thing, it might be adaptive in some situations if the things really are uncontrollable. There may not be sense in wasting energy on trying to control those things. We talked before about coping styles, problem focused versus emotion focused coping. When you can't do anything about the problem, then you shouldn't direct your energies towards problem-focused coping. You should direct them on emotion-focused. So I'm going to try to deal with these feelings that are caused by this uncontrollable event. Okay. Other research on learned helplessness looks at older adults. Substantial research looking at older adults in assisted living facilities and nursing homes has found that if you encourage a sense of helplessness by taking responsibility for all their decisions, which researchers have done intentionally to see what happens, but also is done by staff unintentionally, out of the goodness of their heart, trying to do for people. But if you do for people and you don't let them make their own decisions, it seems to result in negative psychological and physical outcomes. Right? So telling people, okay, well, we're going to decide what activities you're going to do, when you need to take your pills, don't worry about a thing, we got it all. Doing that, people do less well. They say, okay, you need to be sure and remember to take your medicine. People are here to help if you need it, but it's your responsibility, and you've got to keep your room clean, and you've got to do these things for yourself. Those people, among all adults, do better. They're happier, better adjusted, and they live longer. So notice though that this is different from the original paradigm. Right? The original paradigm, with the dogs, learned helplessness occurred because people were unable to avoid a negative stimulus. In these older adults, this research, there is no negative stimulus. Now it seems that a similar sense of helplessness that we see in these other studies can be induced via instruction, just being told directly or indirectly that you can't take care of yourself, that you're helpless, by suggesting to people, either directly, you can't do it, or indirectly. And by saying indirect, I mean if you say, I will do it for you, the meta message, the message behind I will do it for you is you can't do it for yourself. That we can induce the sense of helplessness just by doing that. They don't have to have experience negative events that they can't control if we just tell them that they can't control things, which is pretty powerful. But again, the flip side of that is if you tell people they can control things, it seems to associate with better outcomes. Related to that, depression. Depressed individuals report a sense of lack of control. That's a pretty common complaint. And it seems that for many individuals, not all, but many individuals that suffer from major depressive disorder, that there was some instance in their life where they experienced failure that they were unable to prevent. Right? Could be in work, in relationship, in school, but then that failure generalizes to a sense of global helplessness, that I can't do anything. And unlike what we see in these other experimental paradigms, that sense of helplessness doesn't fade as quickly. Right? We think about kind of extinction, and it doesn't fade, doesn't become extinguished, because depression also influences thinking, and people with depression tend to think more negative thoughts and will ruminate on their failures, and so they'll reactivate their sense of helplessness by thinking again about, oh, I failed, I couldn't do anything about it. Whereas if you fail once, you can do anything about it, you have developed a sense of helplessness, but then you stop failing, by chance you're able to experience a success, then your sense of helplessness would go away. But the thing about depression is people will continue to remind themselves of their failure, so they'll continue to feel helpless, and that feeling won't go away because they're keeping it alive by thinking about it. Okay. Related to helplessness is this idea of locus of control. Right? And you remember what Rotter said about individuals, that they differ with regard to how strongly they believe they have an ability to generate a desired outcome. Right? We have these generalized expectancies, and so we can put people on this continuum in terms of higher an internal locus of control. Generally, I expect to be able to achieve rewards and avoid punishments, or an external locus of control. It's really not up to me to get rewards or avoid punishments. Whatever happens, happens. So what do we know about these individual differences, what are they associated with? Well, not surprisingly, depression is associated generally with an external locus of control. So depressed individuals are more likely to have an external locus of control, which makes sense given what we just said about learned helplessness. Right? But most people with an external locus of control aren't depressed. And so just because you have an external locus of control doesn't mean you're going to be depressed. What do you think that other moderating factor might be? So if you think about external locus of control being a risk factor for depression, well, it will only lead to depression when, a couple things, but maybe one of them, when you experience a failure. So people that have external locus of control, if life generally tends to go well for them, why would they be depressed? Right? It's not until you experience some failure that's beyond your control that you'll develop this to learn helplessness and experience a sense of depression. In terms of achievement, which is valued in our culture, people with an internal locus of control achieve more, both in the kind of classroom setting and outside the classroom setting, and kind of occupation settings. And it makes sense, because if you feel you're responsible for outcomes, both positive and negative, then you'll modify your behavior to achieve better outcomes, assuming you want that good outcome, assuming you want a better job. If everybody wants a better job, a better grade, more money, whatever, the people that think that they can do something about it will change what they're doing to get the better stuff, versus people that have an external locus of control. If it's beyond your control, there's no point in changing and doing anything differently, right? If you don't grow, you don't achieve. Right? If you keep doing the same thing over and over again, unless you just happen to be outstanding at something naturally, you're not going to achieve very much. Usually, to achieve in our society, you've got to get better than whatever level you start at. And people that have external locus of control are less likely to improve, because improvement takes effort, and why expend the effort if it's not going to lead to more rewards? The rewards will only come if I get lucky, if my boss likes me, if whatever. Right? Okay. The role of locus of control in therapy, psychotherapy. One thing that, generally, locus of control becomes more internal following therapy, psychotherapy. And your book talks about how some people with external control may do better with the therapist more in control, where the therapist takes control. And there's some truth to that, but I want to caution you when you think about that initially in therapy, that sometimes needs to happen. When people feel out of control, that they feel safer, and the therapeutic relationship, which is important, can only be established when the therapist is more active and takes more control. Right? But eventually, because we know that external locus of control is associated with negative outcomes when people experience failure, we can't insulate people from failure. We're going to fail eventually. It seems to be important to encourage eventually a shift to a more internal locus of control. Right? And they may experience some unhappiness and some distress as that happens, but the idea is that it's in their best interest in the long run to be able to take more responsibility for outcomes, and to have a sense that they can control things. But at the same time, you don't want to encourage self-blame, and this can be a thin line. Therapists know some people have experienced negative events where you want them to take responsibility for their feelings and for their future behaviors. But if something horrible was done to them, you don't want them to blame themselves for that. Well, if I can control everything, then why did this bad thing happen to me? It must be because I'm bad, or I wanted that bad thing to happen. And that's not helpful. So it's a delicate balancing act sometimes. But locus of control, and being able to explain why things happen to you, your attributions, and then what you expect in terms of how much control you have over the world, those are important things to address in therapy context. Last thing I want to talk about locus of control would be health-related behaviors. In general, people with high internal locus of control engage in more health-sustaining behaviors. Right? They go to the doctor more, they eat better, because again, they can do something about their health. So They will. If you can't do anything about it, well, I get sick, why would you do anything about it? But this isn't a fully consistent finding because it's, again, moderated by this other variable, which is that RV, right, your reinforcement value. Internals engage in more health-sustaining behavior if they place a relatively high value on good health. So if being healthy is important to people with internal locus of control will do more health-promoting behaviors than people with external. But if it's not important to you, then you probably won't. Even though you could do something about it, you don't really care. Okay, so summing up. This is just a smattering, just a smidgen of the research on how behavior is influenced by learning experiences. And it's clear just from, I think, from the little bit we've talked about, that much of how we are, and hence how we are different from others, which is personality, right, is influenced by the experiences we have. Right? And some people might see this as kind of depressing. Oh, so I'm just like a rat in a maze, and it's just some sort of combination of rewards and punishments that lead to where I am now. But it's only depressing if you forget your consciousness, your mind, and cognition. We'll talk more about cognition in the next chapter. You have been influenced by experiences up to this point, you will continue to be influenced by experiences. But, and this is a big but, you have the power to choose new and different experiences. The freedom of your choice, how easy it will be to choose new experiences, will be influenced by past experiences, but there is still some freedom there. You can try things you've never done before. You can try being a different way than you are now. You can try being in a different relationship than you've been in the past. Right? Your past has influenced where you are, but your future isn't laid out so. It's not mapped out. If it was, then we could look at people and say, okay, well, looking at your life course so far, I can tell you exactly where you're going to be in 10 years, and we can't do that with any kind of accuracy. So, assuming you haven't developed a sense of learned helplessness, after thinking about this, you will be able to decide what experiences to seek out, what reinforcers you want to place more value on and strive for, and how to create an environment that will be more supportive of being the type of person you want to be and being as happy as you want to be. Okay, that's all for now. Take care.